Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Ryan Smith. Welcome to ModX Network Voices, where we have experts come on and talk about industrialized construction topics. And I'm here with my partner, Ivan Rupnik. Ivan, welcome everyone.
Hey, Ryan. Hi, everybody.
Thanks for joining again. And in our series today, we have Stacy Scapano. Stacy is with Skender, and he'll be introducing himself a bit. I met Stacy some years ago when we were working on the National Institute of Building Sciences Offsite Construction Council. He is an expert in the digital application of software technology for the solutions of industrialized construction. And we'll talk a little bit about his experience and also his current company, Skender. So welcome, Stacy.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, everyone, for joining today and or watching a recording of this. And happy to be here and definitely happy to share our story. Pretty exciting times.
That's great. And Stacy, in order to share your story, I think you have some slides you'd like to share and talk through it a little bit. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. I'll fire that up right now. Yeah, so as Ryan mentioned, my name is Stacy Scapano. I have a fortunate opportunity to be the Chief Technology Officer at Skender. Personally, before I get into what we're doing at Skender, I feel my professional career in our industry has been a phenomenal journey. Dumb luck and timing is probably the best description of its drivers. I was working, of all places, as I was going to school to be a civil engineer at South Florida. I also was happening to be working at a steel fabrication company as a hand drafting board detailer for structural steel. And the reason why I think that's important, I mean, literally from my first experiences in our industry, one thing you learn that, things tend to flow downhill when you're looking at the world from a trade contractor. You don't have any opportunities. I mean, you start cutting steel and installing it, everything needs to be coordinated. So it was an interesting entry point into the industry. It was also an entry point to really look at opportunities of prefabrication very early, because that's just the way you want to process steel. Nobody wants to cut and weld holes or torch holes out on site when you're moving big steel around. But I also, like I said, entered in as a board draftsman. When Microsoft gave us Windows, that turned into really cheap PCs, which turned into every desktop, every station having a desktop, which turned into CAD, which turned into BIM proliferation in the 90s, and then the internet happened. And my professional career and just the advancements of technology just kind of have constantly have been just adjoining waves. I think I was able to work at a couple different design firms, a couple different construction firms before I went into the technology space in 2004, when BIM was really becoming, it was really nascent in the United States at least, and especially in construction, and was able to support the AGC's BIM forum efforts as the technology chairman there. Wandered through some technology companies, most notably this being the senior strategist at Autodesk for building construction, and ultimately went back into industry beginning in 2016 with Skanska, and then ultimately here at Skender. So, in summary, what was fascinating is the technologies as I entered in was really, mechanical drafting arms on manual drafting tables when I entered, to when I walked off stage for my last Autodesk University conference, talking about IoT and AI and analytics and automation. So, I mean, the disruptions that we've seen have been real, mobile computing, of course, being in there somewhere. But what I've always been most intrigued about, or maybe this is just a function of aging, or maybe some would even call it maturity, but the innovations that are coupled by new strategies, or in a more general sense, new business models that really can embrace and adopt make way, create these new environments for applying these technologies. And I think that when you get both working in concert, I think some really magical things can happen. And I think that kind of leads us to our conversation today. I genuinely, as Ryan said, we've looked at offsite construction for quite some time. We've been able to have the privilege of learning from other geographies that may be outpacing us a little bit. But as I said, we've had remnants of it or traces of it even in our traditional delivery model when you look at how the trades have operated for quite some time. So I don't want to do a disservice there.
Yeah.
But if we change the story to Skender, it's been fascinating. Basically a 64-year-old regional contractor here in Chicago. And I think that's a really important framing for moving forward in this conversation. It's not a venture-backed manufacturing company. It's not a trade. It's really a general contractor that spent some time really picking apart some of our quote unquote industry dysfunctions and looking at its opportunities. And the 101 no-brainer to offsite is like trying to make our productivity curve, which is anemic or failing, to look like the up and right graphs that we've all seen relative to manufacturing is really key. The Henry Ford analogy, I think, is really interesting. Carl Benz created the horseless carriage, the first automobile in 1886. It wasn't until 30 years later that Ford industrialized that product. And then it put us on a pathway of democratizing transportation. And I think modular construction, the manufacturing metaphor is obviously loud here, but I think if you played this metaphor out in a number of different ways, you can kind of see the comparison from traditional construction to an offsite industrialized construction setting. One of the most notable documents that drove our executive team was the 2017 analysis that McKinsey did of our industry around that productivity and the productivity challenges. And they identified about 7 different levers that are intentionally difficult to read here. I'll unpack a few of them quickly and briefly to kind of talk about how our team landed on the Skender strategy to see whether or not we can make way to these 8 to 9% productivity gains in contracting, these 8 to 10% design and engineering gains, to some total of potentially 50% productivity gains, which just seems like a moonshot and almost ludicrous numbers until you really start exploring them and watching some, approaching these categories in a different way. And again, this goes back to some of my earlier statements around business model strategy as well as technology. So, really quickly, before we get into a discussion with Ryan and Yvonne, McKinsey did a really great job. I'll skip regulation. That's a big beast for probably a totally different webinar. But if you look at our industry and its collaboration and contracting models, of course, design, bid, build continues to be the lion's share of the way that we have that we set up teams and structure our contracts and our delivery models. We've had about a 20-year plus minus kind of growth of design build, and at the cream of the crop, an integrated project delivery model that was driven a lot by the work that the IAA has driven in partnership with AGC. For us, we didn't just mobilize investments and initiatives around offsite construction, basically popping up a factory and moving construction indoors. We took an assessment when we were picking apart the 2017 McKinsey charts, and we were also looking at what's the current state of adoption in 2017, 2018 of offsite, what are its inhibitors, and we realized that one of the things that tended to be indicative of the players in the space is, going back to my personal intro, a lot of modular or panelized prefabrication contractors were effectively subcontractors on a project. And this puts you in the position of something that looks very traditional. A design gets done, decisions are being made, it's independent of means and methods structurally in those contracts because you want to give that freedom to the general contractor. to be able to bid and source their production teams, the supply chains the way they want. So there is an intentional by design disconnect. And what we did is we stood up a design studio headed by Tim Swanson, our chief design officer, who came over from Canon, and really started our offsite production investments with a kind of mirror end or bookended effort of design for manufacturing, with a standing up a design practice that is going to point designs and provide us new models. So instead of, if you look at the 3-year progression, instead of bidding work as a general contractor, or now basically bidding work as an offsite subcontractor, we have a number of different entry points into a real estate development project that could be as early as advising a developer on, how to bank land that's going to tee up these strategies downstream. This is well beyond making sure that your floor plates and your unit boxes and your rooms are parameterized to, what you can actually produce, which, that tends to cause a lot of friction when you don't have that early engagement, to say the least. So that's a huge lever. And I also think it makes this beautiful learning environment for us to continue to accelerate. If I kind of keep talking back towards productivity is the main theme for the day. Whether or not our design team is building out their design libraries for modular, what I did when I was, that young draftsman, what was really great about being in fabrication is what I drew today, I can go out at lunch in the next week or two and go out onto our factory floor and follow that work, that intellectual capital down through the process, and get that feedback from a shop foreman or a fabricator saying, hey, look, the way you're dimensioning, this plate detail doesn't make sense. And we get this literally on a weekly basis with our design teams. And I think this provides amazing opportunities both for us as a system and then kind of as a broader industry to be able to continue to get constructability, would be kind of, I would say, like a 2000s term, to a pure design for manufacturer mindset, process, and then suite of tools, let alone a delivery model that's based around it. So when you kind of rock through these different levers that you can find in that McKinsey document, the design and engineering perspective, I've talked about of kit of parts. Ryan and Yvonne was like, what are these markets that you guys service? You really look strategically as what fits really well. I mean, you can try to, prefabricate and take an offsite approach to 100% of the market, and there's some merit to that, trying to, eat the elephant. But what we also look at is those opportunities to take in 2020, the ability to say, hey, I'm going to invest in a mass production like mindset and team and process, but I'm also trying to allow for the opportunities of mass customization that really don't have to be a pick one. You don't have to have a hard trade-off. So when we look at our market applications, we tend to have kind of 3 primary markets around residential, especially around the multifamily, of course, the hospitality, healthcare, where you can get repeatability, you can get economies of scale at the singular project level. But when you're really code switching the same module for a 3-story walk up to a 12-story multifamily, and they're relatively the same fundamental building block, that's when your economies of scale are bridging out beyond how big your one project is to how much of your production portfolio is leveraging your kit of parts. And that's where the business model, if you really think about that, it adds a whole bunch of new variables for you kind of fine tune how you go out and build your pipelines and what becomes strategic. There's a number of kind of secondary markets that we're exploring with some really exciting customers that inherently think of their real estate portfolio, their buildings, as effectively products, rinse and repeat. And they're operating on such large scale. So they aren't, and they're relatively new emergent players in the space, being driven by a bunch of other economic disruptions, and just building large footprints as quickly as possible. And those types of clients in that type of a mindset also kind of are a no-brainer to find as really good partners. And if we had much more time, I could kind of unpack those secondary markets in more detail. But this image here I'll land on briefly. It's just that notion of your same quote unquote box, which offsite prefabrication gets criticized a lot for. This looks very repeatable, looks very blocky. We have the ability to skin this thing up and down from an exterior perspective, from a glazing perspective, from a finish perspective, from an appliance package perspective, to really, just like I said, try to surf that nexus of mass production opportunities for affordability and the economics, let alone the mass customization that allows you to kind of fine tune, be community sensitive to these properties or brand sensitive to certain clients. And in 2020, that's a real conversation to be had. That's not like over aspirational thinking or kind of reaching for a brass ring these days. It's our day to day. Obviously, when you think to something that's offsite construction and industrialized, you really start thinking about your quote unquote supply chain. Even that phrase, it has kind of a very manufacturing like mindset versus traditionally, as you see this kind of video of your typical library of building products and swatch samples and finishes. The traditional model of building product manufacturers working with designers to kind of get spec'd in. The project goes out to bid, and other building product manufacturers try to get alternates put in to go into the submittals to unseat that. That's extremely dysfunctional if you're looking at the world from a building product manufacturer's view. What we end up doing is really engaging our supply chain very intimately in the design process. We walk them out on the production floor. We talk about unit projects. We talk about our product libraries, and we're collaborating on the solve. So many times, in traditional construction, you'll bid work and you'll try to sit there and just drive costs down at a product purchase decision level. But what that actually does imply are there are other trade-offs in production. You may save money on the initial purchase of, say, a toilet for that matter, but not realize that you've just created floor penetrations, a lot of site work for the install, where I can, pay a 20% uplift on the product, provide a more premium toilet, and then get more than that in savings on, a 4-minute install on station number 3 on my factory floor. And so we're really, because we're exposing ourselves to means and methods by design, in design, that allows us to create different trade-off calculations to optimize the solutions. And we do that in conjunction with our partners. And I think that's been a phenomenal portion of the journey that we continue to realize, and we continue to try to codify in our delivery. Really quickly, as I kind of round the bend, there's a lot of people that ask, what about the design of your production facility? I'll get to technology in a minute. I do think about, the production facility, the workstations themselves as capability building. I think about how we recruit and partner with our labor unions that are local, how we do training, and how we augment their help, as well as engage them. We've got, a number of nonprofits that help us with sourcing labor, that help with wraparound services that after employment they can follow and, teach relatively, new folks to our industry that may have come in from, say, convenience foods, or, came out of a year ago, they may have been in restaurant service, and now they're, a labor hauler in our production facility. We're providing a really holistic approach to solving the challenges that we have with sourcing labor, attracting talent to our industry, as well as kind of just aging. In the state of Maine, for instance, your average trade contractor is around 46 years old in 2020. And that's kind of a canary in a coal mine for our industry. And people are jumping directly to automation as a solution, as you know, kind of the no-brainer solution. We found a really interesting, innovative approach in partnership with our unions and partnerships with nonprofits to look at how we cultivate and do workforce development. And it's more than just teaching tools. I mean, our teams are extremely diverse in many dimensions, from gender, from age, from socioeconomics to, you know, just, you know, some of them biking to our factory in the little village of Chicago. But they tend to own the factory. We you know, top down, we were designing the production line about 18 months ago. If you go out on the shop floor every Tuesday, there's a stand down, and our laborers, our haulers, our journeyman carpenters that are there, you know, and in some cases, some of the trades that support us will tell us how we can continually improve ergonomics of a workstation, product design, you know, tool pathing, the flows of material, and it gives us that ability to continue to whittle away 0.5 percentage point of productivity every couple of weeks. And again, I think it's been interesting to really stress test that notion of you know, McKinsey saying there's, you know, our structural functions have challenges that are on the order of 50% a penalty in terms of productivity. This is a really great example. As smart as we thought we were, you know, our first versions of quote unquote products that are being deployed on projects had roughly about 40 different types of fasteners that we found that, you know, the groups on the floor were like, why are we doing these? You know, why do we have so many different fasteners and screws to keep track of for each application? And it was really a flag, you know, that cable pull from kind of the Toyota way of stopping the line, saying, hey, this doesn't make sense. Let's bring in every stakeholder up and down the delivery cycle to figure out how can we do this in a better way. Take those learnings and begin with those learnings on the next project. And I think that's, you know, if you're reading between the lines, those are enormous differentiators besides construction indoors, you know, weatherproof, you know, safer environment. Those tend to be the 101 conversations. When you're in flight, you just see these things over and over again, and you can kind of rock them through these different levers. I'll lightly talk about site execution but in reality, I have you beat on, you know, morning of day one of our module. You know, we're working at hip height on a ceiling that's upside down. Every time I touch that ceiling that's flipped over on our work tables, you know, I've got jigging, I've got manufacturing, but it's equivalent out on my traditional construction site is getting to the right floor, moving a ladder, walking up the ladder to touch the ceiling. And so when you look at that right there, these are huge force multipliers. And like I said, you know, this is morning of day one of the life of a module. And you just realize it's a genuine apples and oranges. It is not pulling construction indoors when you're trying to look at these gains and trying to continue to create a learning environment, and an environment, quite frankly, that accelerates. So I'll lightly talk about that, but, you know, as I kind of wind down and begin to turn the conversation over to Ryan and Yvonne, and the technology side, as I said, you know, we've exploded for many reasons, especially in the last decade. As Steve Jobs gave us the iPad in 2011, my team at Autodesk was part of the acquisition of the first app on the iPad. You know, so I feel that I've seen a lot of it in context, as well as, you know, the before, during, and after. And, you know, here we are in 2020, where we just ended a season of, and technically still going on, of an injection of a lot of venture capital, creating a lot of supply of new technologies. My point about the controlled environment for the people is almost equally relevant for the controlled environment for some of these emergent technologies. The challenge with deploying just technologies, even automation on a traditional construction site, is that, you know, your construction site is literally a different environment every day. You know, one day it's just you know, slabs and columns, and, you know, the next day walls are going up and some framing's going up, and the next day, you know, things are closed in and windows are in. And that environment makes it really difficult for some of these emergent technologies to really hit stride. And we can kind of control the environment. We can bring digital information right to the face of the work. We can house projection systems in the factory because the roof never moves, and we can project down and really help our teams locate and identify parts or do quality control. And we can literally digitize every step of the process to really augment that workforce development model that I talked about, so that literally it's morning, day one, mod one, I need to install that ceiling frame, and you literally can digitize every step of the way, walk through the instruction set, walk through the shops that are needed, walk through the quality inspection plans to just continue to make sure that as the line may be producing a 3-story walk-up, a hotel the next day, and the hospital the next day, our teams just really agilely flip through them, and the whole system's extremely connected. And again, that controlled, putting as much scope as possible on that production line in that controlled environment. It's not a weather thing, even though that's great. That de-risks the project. It's not a safety thing, even though that's extremely great. You've just got a platform that you really can, like I said, be very strategic about chipping away at those productivity gains that McKinsey's promising. So Ryan, Yvonne, I probably took all the air out of the room on this webinar. I'll turn it back over to you guys to answer any questions.
Not at all. Not at all. That was amazing. That's really inspiring stuff, Stacy. So you got it. Yeah. So a lot to unpack here. But I actually wanted to first identify some key terms that you brought up that we try to bring up a lot, but as academics, we get seen as encumbering the progress of people's business of making money. Because the promise of offsite and the promise of manufacturing has been speed and cost.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is, and it's also the promise of technology. So if we buy the right equipment, or if we put construction in a factory, we will see cost benefits for speed benefits. And we, as architects, academics, say, well, hold on, that's not even how manufacturing works. And folks then say, well, that's not what we were promised. So I wanted to come back. There's a key term before we even jump into the questions. Before you even said, one of the key terms I really appreciate, you said the factory was a learning environment. And I think that's something we've forgotten. So, you also showed some photos of the Ford factory, the first assembly line. So that was actually, set up by Frank and Lillian Gilbreth. And they were really highly paid management consultants who did work for Ford, and then that work was burned by Ford. So we don't know what they did, but they emphasized this idea of the learning environment as well. This was a big part of what distinguished those management practices from just optimization. And so it's just something we kind of forgotten. And when Toyota comes back in the 70s and saves the car industry from itself, they say the same thing. Yeah. And then you're saying the same thing. And it turns out it's a very hard argument to make, because it takes some time, it takes some discipline, and it doesn't just take money, it actually takes a cultural shift. And so maybe, is that a fair assessment? And from your experiences now actually doing this?
More than fair, Yvonne. Where I thought you were going to end up, I thought it wasn't going to include the word culture. I think the best image that I gave you was the whiteboard versus the labor crew. There was a amazing kind of top-down, this is how said line will work. This is workstation 1. This is workstation 5. This will be our throughput. And that's very hierarchical thinking, so to speak. And you have to start. You have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
That was a natural place. However, especially on the factory floor, especially with our engineering team that's engaged the way they are, we do empower our workforce to pull that cord in that Toyota way kind of concept of this isn't working. And we go the intentional step of doing what's called a Gemba walk, which is stop, make some time at the end of a work day or at a specific time during the work week, as we're breaking down, stop about an hour early and look for what were the process improvements that we committed to previously? Is there something new? Is there a new constraint to consider? And that's the challenge. And as we get into technology, one of the things that I like talking about is you've got to start a process before you can be improving it. And that shell game of where are you going to invest time, money, or resources, it is really informed by just getting your baseline out, but making sure that learning environment is there. Those touches on the touch screen can get you down to every task and getting feedback loops from every task. The transaction from workstation to workstation can get you quality for that scope of work, you know, as well as what we'll be doing and kind of monitoring during delivery and what we're doing while we're doing the installs. So the whole system is really predicated on that culture of we're going to ingest the feedback loop, be open to the feedback loop, and, you know, not kind of drop the iron fist of, you know, it's written this way.
Yeah, and that's lean construction. That's that's lean manufacturing, and that's continuous improvement approaches to construction. So some clarifying questions, Stacy, and then I'll have sort of a deeper question for you to unpack. Clarifying questions: do you hire your own labor in the factory, or is that a subcontracting? Are those subcontractors that are just hired laborers? So do you own the?
Both.
Oh, it's both.
It's actually both. Yeah. So we have an interesting, relatively unique labor agreement with the Carpenters Union, to where most of the scope that we do actually follows under this manufacturing agreement with the carpenters. Because of the environment and regulations here in kind of the Chicago Metroland area, we end up contracting our supply chain that our historic trade relationships with unionized shops for various scopes, especially around MEP, and they follow that work. So we intentionally try not to quote unquote fabricate. The closest thing we are is a steel fabricator that assembles with their trades as you go down the line. So it's a hybrid model that I think is a really interesting solution at this stage of the game. And you know, it's also another opportunity to take feedback and learning and figure out what works best with all parties.
And then on the design side, so, you know, further up the supply chain, do you vertically integrate design, or are you still partnering with Canon and other architects to deliver on your projects? Yeah.
So also both. So I told you we had multiple entry points. So Canon, our chief design officer, formerly ran the city practice and design practice, some of the design practices at Canon, who came over to Skender. We built up our own design team. And so that's why I said we can go through the earliest of early engagements with a developer, as far as even just kind of consulting, you know, the feasibility studies, all of those things. We can enter into a project in kind of chapter 2 of if a developer is already working with an architect. Hopefully it's very early in those conversations, and I am probably going to just totally distort the language, but, you know, almost in like a production architectural role, where you've got a design scheme and plan that's being developed by a design firm, and we really kind of tune that for the manufacturing process. There is an opportunity to continue to behave like the majority of production firms that are out there, the manufacturing firms are out there, as a subcontractor, and definitely our least preferred, not because we don't want those projects, but it really kind of so many of the decisions needed to kind of optimize for those efficiency gains are already kind of baked into the design. And in some cases, they're even run counter to some of those efficiencies. And I think that's when you're in a square peg round hole environment and you're just trying to make it work. You'll still get gains. They may be schedule, they may be cost, they may be both. But that's where you're creating a lot of tension is really some of those decisions that could have pointed you in different directions very early.
You know, that, and to follow on, you know, just as a, sorry, Ivan.
That's okay.
Just to follow on that, because I was trying to get that frame for where across the supply chain you're vertically integrating, what kind of scopes you are trying to become more productive in, right?
Right.
Certainly you're trying to hit all those pieces you showed on that bar chart, but there are different tactics to actually accomplish those strategies. Certainly, And so what do you, we are absolutely fascinated, and I think this is why Skender continues to come up as an interesting case study, and frankly right? A test bed for this kind of idea, which is a general contractor, established general contractor, shifting gears, pivoting, whatever you want to call it, and starting to take on more of the supply chain and a manufacturing approach. And this is a big question, but what do you think are the most difficult cultural challenges or even technical challenges you have faced as a general contractor making this pivot? An established general contractor. Yeah.
So there's kind of a no-brainer. I mean, so when I say it, it's going to sound obvious, but it just, when you start these journeys, you're solving for so many things, and that's why I try my best to even structure it from somebody else's framework, because you're running like a chicken with your head cut off with these initiatives, just trying to get these production lines up as fast as possible. I think the challenge that we have with general contracting as an industry is I would say kind of twofold. It is a project by project unit of measure, and technically for design too. I mean, you chase work, you bid work, you win work, you live and die by a project. When you are thinking now of formalizing a product that could be implemented across projects, that's a totally different mindset. And that's why I even started very early on my own introduction around, it's really a business model shift. It's not so much just a delivery model shift. Here's what I mean. So in bidded work, if we go, whatever you want to debate me on, design, bid, build still being relevant in our industry. So let's just say it's 70%. 70% of our work as a contractor that bids, when we're bidding work, if I understand the actual cost of the building and I put in my fee, that fee now is a window for someone to underbid me. So what that means is I have an asymptote of 0 to negative profits on projects as an industry, because anytime someone raises the bar on cost, you basically can erode someone else's profits. And that's really why, we kind of begrudgingly joke about we're in the low single digits on a good year as a builder. What that sets you up for is a really constrained ability to source capital, to mobilize capital investments, the capital investments that are necessary to stand these things up. I joked in a conference a couple of weeks ago. I mean, we're effectively a rental business. The crane's a rental, the labor's a rental. Everything that you see on a construction site, rented. You, in one way, form or another. There's different models even there. That's a topic of another webinar on equipment rentals. But you don't want to mobilize capital. You want to be able to point all the finances to that project economic. When you are sourcing capital that you hopefully get washed back out on the volume of work that's going through that capital, it's just it's here we are again, apples and oranges. And so that creates the tension of how do you grind through the gearboxes of you've created a healthy company for hundreds of years, or for the last 20 years, or 64 years in our case, and begin to decouple it. And ironically, here in 2020, where we've lost Clayton Christensen, who authored The Innovator's Dilemma, you end up getting back to what he said in the 90s of when you generate an innovative initiative in an established company, it's probably safest to decouple it and have those lunatics in their own asylum. And so you have to figure out how to toggle that. We have landed on language like this has been a start in. We have evolved constantly from, what is being incubated versus, when's the baby ready to get out of the nest and operate on its own 2 feet and run through those transitions. And that's exactly where you find us right now.
Great. I wanted to, I think based on all the stuff that we're learning about Skender, it's really, we're also trying to understand as ModX, trying to understand the categories of innovation and the drivers that are happening in the marketplace. So we've seen in the US, as you pointed out, most modular manufacturers are subcontractors. That's a typical situation in the US. That is almost, that is something you can't find outside of the US. And that's actually because of risk. So if you're going to invest all this money into a facility that is even more automated than yours, no one else would be willing to take that little control over a project that costs so much. So it seems like the culture of procurement and the culture of the business model of construction in the US is a problem. That is hard. So it's interesting to see the general contractor going in this direction, because it is the business of construction that, as we have, it seems to be a problem. We were speaking with somebody a couple of weeks ago who's looking at construction data, and this construction data startup had some pretty good data that said that 90% of projects go over budget and about 50% of projects go double over budget. And yet we bid for the lowest. We bid for the lowest. We award the lowest bid, knowing that that is a fiction, right? So I'm just throwing some of those things out there. So it seems like the culture of Skender is changing. That seems and it seems like a really important but painful process. But do we see Skender is a big player and was playing in that, let's say, old business model? Do you see this as a potential model for modular in the US? That the GC, it's a GC driven, because we've seen developer driven initiatives, Factory OS, for example. Do you see this as a good model? I mean, would you advocate this to other big GCs?
Yeah, no, this is a great conversation. I had the fortunate ability to sit in on some of the industrialized construction classes at Stanford, and got a similar line of questions on, the VC backed, the developer backed, the trade contract backed, and
right.
The speaker before me actually was like, and the worst position is a GC backed. It's just like, oh, I love it. This is great. Yeah, the underdog. They all have different strengths and weaknesses. Right. I mean, I don't want to frame it up as a competitive conversation, because it's totally not. The competition is the traditional model versus all of us. Right. The pluses in the category, the arguments for a GC backed approach is you've got existing developer relationships, you've got existing labor and trade relationships, which are pretty much devoid from any of those other entry points into these investments. Right. And so this is why I would advocate. To the notion of risk that you brought up earlier, all valid points, with one exception. If you're an advocate to stay, heads in the sand, kind of, the industry's fine as is, low single digits to negative profits seems like a lot of risk to me as well.
Right.
And I think that's just really, and grew up in construction, so any of my general contracting brethren and sisters out there that are watching this, we just joke, profit is won or lost in pre-con. It's before you even break ground. So there's just, as McKinsey very acutely demonstrated, there are just all of these levers, and what we found as the best platform was for us to mobilize these two strategies in concert: the design for manufacturing, in-house architecture design firm, coupled with manufacturing and engineering, to couple with construction. And like I said, as soon as you start looking at that Rubik's Cube, as soon as you take another perspective, you realize you're getting more and more options. And like I said, the best thing I can do is try to throw them into one of those categories.
So in a way, also the architects that you work with become more client reps and less project. So I think like you were saying, it's interesting. You were saying, well, we're kind of like, we have sort of in-house production architects, but not really, because production architects are trapped by badly designed projects. I mean, I've worked for production architecture offices, and the interesting thing about the discipline of manufacturing is that prevents those kinds of weird hierarchies from happening. Now the design architect that works with the developer is actually forced to question their own and the developer's own presuppositions about what makes a good unit, not to mention what makes a good project. And so one other thing that I saw, can you talk a little bit about how, and this is a big question, but how has the chassis or the module, the 3D volume changed even in the process, in this relatively new process? Because in the industry right now, especially in the wood side, but also in the steel side, there's a kind of 3D chassis where some of the problems of on-site construction happen in the factory. What you have to climb around. I saw you guys were making because you're sort of making sub-assemblies. Is that something you started with? Is that something that has evolved? So how has the box changed for Skender as opposed to the rest of the industry?
Yeah, and so our chassis have been relatively steady state. It provides a fantastic foundation for us to just say, in Gen 1, Gen 2 of our products, of our journey, chapters in the book that we're trying to write, the chassis is a good problem solved at this moment. It provides rapid installation. In many ways, if you come to my factory floor or you go to the prototype and I actually show you and point the chassis out, I actually joke it's almost an ancient version of the cornerstone in traditional architecture. It frames up the beginnings of production. It frames up the assembly. And so having that thing solved allows me to go pick my poison elsewhere. So most of the changes are really on production processes, fit finish, performance capabilities, and we're really aiming kind of products improvements in kind of those categories. There are some token learnings that we continue to throw at the chassis. But we're not even in an 80-20 conversation at this point. When you're talking about some incremental gains on how to set the thing up, incremental gains on making the connection process marginally more efficient. But the structure, I think what's been interesting with some of our partners that we work with, especially around those block corner connections, the way we weld the chassis up, it's a good solution. It's a good enough solution, and I'm already underselling it, and it allows us to kind of point our attention elsewhere. I mean, you can sweat these things all day long. If I could do this, if I could do this, then you'd be in this mindset of, you're designing a unicorn that no one wants to buy. Yeah. And you want to find that bit of tension. If you're in a product-based business, there's this notion of an MVP. If you're in technology, you hear a minimum viable product. You want to be beyond that. Our design officer will say, our minimum viable product, our good needs to be better than your traditional better, so that when we get to best, we've blown you away. And our good that's going down the line right now is a solid complement or substitute to traditional construction right now.
Sounds like your line and your chassis are you want to get them out there so that the learning environment can start. And then really the improvement it's the continual improvement through actually running the process itself. So you can't solve it all beforehand. But on the other hand, if you're not tracking the production, you're also throwing away capital in the sense of data.
And this is a really good point. It gets you right back to some very fundamental principles in manufacturing. It's that, squeeze the water balloon, something else is going to stick out. Continuous improvement operates that exact way. As soon as you think you have a solution and it gets battle tested, you'll realize the weakest link has moved. And when you go to shore that weak link up, you've then realized there's a different part of the process. It may not be on the production line, may actually be intrinsic in the design, may actually be intrinsic in the setting process out on the site. So that's why it's actually fundamental to begin with that cultural investment and processes around that learning, because it's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, you're going to plateau, or you're going to burn up capital solving problems that only make another problem worse. And that tends to be the case.
Really, really great interview with Staci Scapano, and want to thank him. It's with Skender. Appreciate your time. Very insightful. I think our audience will really enjoy learning about really this culture of learning, culture of labor and training as a major shift in the construction sector. So GC-led industrialized construction operation with Skender. Thank you, Staci, for joining us today. We appreciate you being on ModX.
Cheers, Ryan. Thank you, Ivan.